From boiler ruptures that flung steel through the air like shrapnel to silent fumes that smothered whole trainloads of sleeping passengers, the steam locomotive ranked among the most admired machines ever assembled. It was also among the most lethal things on any railroad, and the people nearest the hazard were always the ones running it. What follows are 10 locomotives that turned on their own crews. Number 10. The Pennsylvania Railroad P5A. During the early 1930s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was stringing wire over its main line and wanted a quick, powerful electric machine for passenger runs. The P5A filled that order. It was swift and muscular, and it carried one serious flaw the crews had been uneasy about from day one. The machine wore a box cab, with the engineer seated at its leading edge. On paper, that gave the crew a clear view ahead. In reality, it left nothing between those men and whatever the locomotive struck. On the New York division, one P5A plowed into a truck heaped with apples at a level crossing. The impact killed the crew where they sat, with no cab structure to shield them. Afterward, the railroad shut down all remaining box cab P5A construction and reworked the design, lifting the cab to the center and adding tapered, streamlined hoods at each end. That revised shape became the basis for one of the most celebrated electric locomotives ever built, the GG1. Getting there cost the lives of crewmen. Number 9. The Best Friend of Charleston. It was the 17th of June, 1831, in South Carolina, when the first locomotive built in America to enter scheduled service also became the first to blow its boiler apart. This machine had been working for roughly half a year on the line of the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company, among the oldest railroads anywhere in the country. Its firemen, said to be irritated by the steady hiss of the safety valve, chose to clamp it shut. Some say he sat on it, others that he lashed it shut with rope. Either way, the outcome was the same. With nowhere for the surplus pressure to escape, the boiler tore open with tremendous force, killing the fireman on the spot and leaving the engineer horribly scalded. The locomotive itself was wrecked. Crews later rebuilt it and named it Phoenix, which says a fair amount about how that age handled irony. Still, the disaster set a template that would recur for more than a century everywhere. Whoever stood closest to the boiler tended to die first, and the equipment meant to keep them safe only did its job when nobody interfered with it. Number 8. Gettysburg Locomotive 1278. On the evening of the 16th of June, 1995, a Pacific-type steam locomotive built in Canada was hauling a 6-car dinner excursion across the Pennsylvania countryside outside Gardner's. There were 310 passengers riding behind it. At 7:20 that night, the firebox roof, known as the crown sheet, let go. What came next arrived in a single instant. Steam heated to several hundred degrees, blasted out the firebox door and straight into the cab. One of the firemen happened to have a shovel pushed through that door at the precise moment it failed. Both firemen leapt clear of the rolling machine. The engineer was Jim Cornell, 48 years old, and he held his post until he had eased the train to a controlled halt before escaping himself. Cornell came away with third-degree burns across roughly 65% of his body. The inquiry uncovered one layer of neglect after another. The water glass, the gauge meant to display the boiler's water level, sat choked with mineral scale and was reporting figures that simply were not true. The feed pump gauge had quit working twice over, and the engineer had finally given up on swapping in a new one. Nothing on board could show the crew how much water was actually getting to the boiler. Investigators also turned up rust coating the driving wheels, an air compressor they called barely operational, and gauges that had been pulled off and never put back. The board ruled that Gettysburg Railroad management had neglected both the locomotive's upkeep and the crew's training. They also sounded a wider warning. The hard-won understanding of how to run steam power was vanishing nationwide, and tourist lines were operating high-pressure machinery their staff no longer truly grasped. Had the firebox lacked the Canadian Pacific style of alternating crown-stay layout, the whole boiler might have detonated rather than just the firebox, and no one in that cab would have walked away. Number 7. The roundhouse explosion at San Antonio. Early on the morning of the 18th of March, 1912, a locomotive boiler blew apart inside Southern Pacific's roundhouse at San Antonio, Texas. The engineer, Walter Jordan, and a shop painter named Jose Fuentes died on the spot. The blast wave swept across the rail yard and into the streets around it. It came amid a savage walkout by shop hands and boilermakers that had dragged on since 1911. With the skilled men on the picket line, the railroad had hired stand-in workers, and one inexperienced hand cranked the safety valve adjusting screw far too tight, letting pressure climb well past anything the boiler could bear. A faulty gauge may have worsened things by reporting the wrong pressure. Talk of sabotage by the strikers floated around for weeks, but the investigators turned up nothing to support it. The boiler itself fell short of accepted standards. The company was found negligent for allowing an untrained man to tamper with critical safety hardware on a vessel that should never have been in service. Number 6. The tunnel killers of the Southern Pacific. Long before the famous cab-forward machines came along, Southern Pacific crews were wrestling with something that was quietly poisoning them. The railroad's main line over the Sierra Nevada ran through a chain of snow sheds and bores, a few of them miles in length. Whenever an ordinary steam locomotive rolled into one of those sealed passages, its exhaust had nowhere to escape to. The smoke drifted back over the engine, flooding the cab with soot and carbon monoxide. Men working the MC1 mallet compound locomotives described struggling to breathe, losing their vision, and nearly passing out as they fought through the mountain tunnels. Crews were being knocked senseless at the throttle of enormous machines dragging tonnage up steep grades. At last, one inventive engineer tried something new. He swung the locomotive around and worked it in reverse, so the chimney sat behind him and the cab led through fresher air. The trick worked well enough that Southern Pacific built a whole fleet engineered to run that way for good. The cab-forward line turned into one of the most recognizable locomotive designs in the country's history. Yet it only came to be because the standard layout had been killing the men at the controls. Number 5. Union Pacific Big Boy 4005. On the 27th of April, 1953, a locomotive weighing roughly 1 million pounds was dragging 62 freight cars over the open plains of southern Wyoming. Aboard the 4005 rode engineer Leo Murray, fireman Lawrence Endress, and brakeman James Anderton. The trip was meant to be an unremarkable haul along the Wyoming line from Rawlins toward Green River. Close to Red Desert, the locomotive met an open switch at 50 miles per hour, and what followed ranks among the most violent derailments in big boy history. The engine lurched off the iron and slid along its left flank, ripping up rail and roadbed the whole way. The tender drove forward into the cab, mangling and folding the steel around the men inside. 18 cars piled up behind, the leading dozen heaping into a tangle 70 feet tall. Tractors, hogs, typewriters, and sewing machines spilled across the desert. Murray and Endress were gone in an instant. Live steam jetted 100 feet skyward and kept rescuers back for hours. Early reports claimed the engineer and fireman were heard talking after the crash, until it emerged that 2 rescue workers had simply been calling across the wreck, each mistaking the other for a survivor. Anderton was dragged out still breathing, burned and broken, only to die 2 days afterward from burns covering some 80% of his body. The 4005 was rebuilt at Union Pacific's Cheyenne shops and put back into service, eventually retiring to the Forney Museum of Transportation in Denver. Each year, the museum stages a memorial it calls Big Boy Day in honor of the crew who perished inside it. Number 4. The Chesapeake and Ohio T1. Number 3020. On the 12th of May, 1948, this enormous 210-4 freight locomotive was laboring up a grade outside Chillicothe, Ohio, when its crew met the one thing steam men dreaded above all. The water in the boiler sank below the crown sheet, which forms the firebox roof and the single hottest surface anywhere on the machine. So long as that plate of steel stays underwater, it holds firm. But once the water falls away and bare metal meets open flame, it weakens within moments. On the 3020, the overheated firebox roof failed at full working pressure. The blast hurled the superheater tubes clear out the front of the locomotive, and fragments of the engine rained down across the Ohio farmland. Engineer, fireman, and front brakeman were all scalded to death by the water and steam. A federal inspector observed afterward that the locomotive had covered close to 10 miles with no water visible in the gauge glass. If these accounts are gripping you the way I suspect they are, tap subscribe. We dig into locomotive history and the machines behind these stories here every week. Number 3. The Bitterfeld locomotive. It was the 29th of July, 1977, when a steam locomotive rolled into the station at Bitterfeld, a modest city in East Germany, and blew itself apart. The tanks in its tender had run completely dry. The boiler had been operating empty for at least 4 minutes by then, while its fusible safety plugs, small metal pieces meant to melt and vent steam before pressure ever reaches a deadly point, had been knocked out of action during a recent maintenance stop at the mining works. Exactly how that came to pass was never explained to the public. With no water left to soak up the heat pouring off the firebox, the steel roof climbed to somewhere near 740 degrees Celsius. At that heat, the metal's structural strength fell from 510 newtons per square millimeter to under 90. The steel did more than fail. It caved in entirely. As the firebox roof collapsed, the boiler shot forward off the frame like an immense projectile, sailing more than 40 meters before fusing itself to the rails where it touched down. Burning coal spilling from what remained of the firebox showered a nearby train and set it ablaze. The locomotive's crew died at once, and their bodies were found afterward atop the roof of the station platform. 5 onlookers were cut down by flying wreckage and killed where they stood, and 2 more lost their lives at the hospital. 9 people died because a safety device had been taken out during maintenance, and nobody caught the mistake before the machine went back into traffic. Number 2. The Chesapeake and Ohio Allegheny, number 1642. This was a 2666, ranking among the biggest and heaviest steam locomotives ever put together. Lima turned it out in 1944, and it tipped the scales at better than 600 tons, while making upward of 7,000 horsepower once it got rolling. On the 9th of June, 1953, it pulled an eastbound freight designated Extra 1642 East, away from Handley, West Virginia. The machine's cold water feed pump had been flagged as failing on the 5th of June, the very day it returned to service after sitting in storage for 4 months. The same defective pump was written up again on the 5th, the 7th, and the 8th. On each occasion, the repair record was closed out with remarks such as tested okay or tested 1 1/4 inches per minute, and on each occasion, the locomotive headed straight back out. That evening at 5:25, with the 1642 nearing Hinton at an estimated 20 miles an hour on level rail, the boiler blew. It killed the fireman, the engineer, and the head brakeman together. From his tower, an operator who saw the train roll up reported nothing odd, only what sounded like a moderate throttle, and then the locomotive flew to pieces. The Interstate Commerce Commission pinned the cause on a crown sheet overheated by low water. That very pump, written up as broken 4 separate times across 4 days, had at last quit for good, and no one in the cab caught it soon enough. The 1642 was never put back together. Its class was already on the way out in favor of diesels, and the explosion stood as one of the last brutal entries in the story of America's superpower steam era. Number 1. Balvano Train 8017. On the evening of the 2nd of March, 1944, a freight train pulled out of Naples bound for Potenza in the south of Italy. It was made up of 47 wagons behind a pair of steam locomotives, and it was carrying cargo. It had no business carrying. Hundreds of desperate civilians, mostly poor families hoping to reach mountain villages where they could trade for food during the war, had scrambled aboard the open freight cars at every halt. By some counts, more than 600 unauthorized riders were on the train. Around midnight, it ran into the Galleria delle Armi, a bore close to 2 kilometers long, driven through the Apennine Mountains on a sharp grade of about 1.3%. The locomotives were feeding on poor-grade wartime coal, perhaps of Yugoslavian origin, that gave off far less heat than proper fuel. It also threw off a great deal more carbon monoxide. The train ground to a stop inside the tunnel. The overloaded cars, slick rails, steep climb, and feeble coal together robbed the locomotives of grip. The wheels spun, the engines strained, and the exhaust slowly filled the passage. Both locomotive crews died first, being nearest to the source. The lead driver on the 476 reached for the reverse gear to ease the train back out, but he blacked out before he could set it. Compounding the trouble, the 2 engines were not the same model. One had its driving controls on the right side of the cab, the other on the left. The drivers could not see, signal, or coordinate, so one engine strained ahead while the other tried to reverse. The engines went on idling for around 30 minutes after the crews had collapsed. Carbon monoxide, with no smell and no color, seeped backward through the freight cars, and most of the riders never stirred again. Those who lived described finding the dead resting calmly, as though sleeping, with tiny beads of blood at their noses. At 5:10 in the morning, brakeman Giuseppe De Venuto, who had pulled through because his brake car sat among the handful still out in the open air, walked back to Balvano station and handed over a report that became one of the most chilling lines in Italian railroad memory. Some versions set down his words plainly as, "They are all dead." More than 500 people died in the tunnel that night. Of the train's crew, only the brakeman and a single fireman from the second locomotive came through alive. The Allied military authority buried news of it to keep Italian spirits from sinking further. Only a month earlier, a similar episode with poison fumes had struck another tunnel on the same route, and still nothing had changed. The complete account of Train 8017 stayed out of public view until years after the fighting ended. Most of the victims, too impoverished even to be named, were laid to rest with no ceremony in 4 mass graves at the Balvano cemetery. Once the disaster was over, steam locomotives were in time barred from the tunnel altogether. A permanent guard post was set up at the tunnel mouth to ensure exhaust from earlier trains had drained off before the following one went in, and it stayed manned until 1959. Every machine in this countdown carried the same route danger. Tremendous heat, tremendous pressure, and the people running it seated close enough to touch it. The safety valve, the water glass, the firebox roof, the grade of the coal in the tender. Each one a lone point of failure standing between an ordinary day's work and disaster. The men who hauled themselves up into those cabs knew exactly what they were risking. In every story we have walked through today, the machine each crew put its faith in became the very thing that took their lives. If these accounts have stayed with you, subscribe so the next one does not slip past you.